Hi everyone, today I want to talk again about fanfiction and original fiction. I've done a video in the past talking about some of the benefits of fanfiction compared to original fiction, and I'll put a link in the description, but this time I want to talk about the grey area between them, because people often talk about them as though they're two distinct categories that are completely separate. But it's not as simple as that. And let's start with an example of a story. And to introduce it, I want to talk about a moment from the Babylon 5 episode, A Late Delivery from Avalon. At the end of this episode, the character of Marcus is jokingly talking about Arthurian legend, and he makes some comment about Merlin living backwards in time and remembering his future. This is a throwaway moment in the series and in the episode. After the plot is concluded with very little relevance except some speculation about character dynamics. But when I watched this episode, I started thinking about the concept of a person remembering their future. Because memory is a very fallible thing. We can only remember what we personally have experienced. We don't remember things precisely, and we get muddled. We forget details, we misinterpret things. So someone remembering the future wouldn't have a clear and perfect understanding of all the things that are going to happen. But even if they did have a really good memory, then would come questions about whether they can change those things if they remember them but they haven't happened yet. And all of this wondering served as the inspiration for the character of Gareth in my Shadows of Tomorrow trilogy. So does Shadows of Tomorrow count as fanfiction because it was inspired by another series? And I'm pretty confident that most people would say no. The characters are completely different from those in the Babylon 5 TV series. The books are set in a parallel version of Earth and deal with time travel and parallel timelines, instead of being set in a space station in the distant future and dealing with wars with aliens. There is no connection between the two apart from this very tenuous link. So Shadows of Tomorrow counts as original fiction. And if we were to draw a sliding scale with completely original works at one end, Shadows would sit pretty close to that end. The actual endpoint would be some hypothetical, perfectly original story that comes completely out of the author's head with no inspirations, parallels, or ties to any other work of fiction. And that would have to be a hypothetical book, because I don't think there's a book on the planet that would ever achieve that level of originality. Because all authors draw to some degree or another from the pool of tropes, narrative standards, and general knowledge soaked up from reading other works of fiction. Even authors who want to deviate from common tropes, to do something unusual, generally know what tropes exist in order to deviate from them. But let's imagine we have found our perfectly original book, and that's at that end of the scale. What would be at the extreme end of the other sliding scale? It would be something that is completely derived from another work, 100% plagiarised with absolutely nothing added or changed. And at that point, that wouldn't be classed as fanfiction either. It would just be a copy. But it serves as a hypothetical endpoint for a scale between completely original and completely unoriginal. So let's think about what would belong close to this sort of completely derived from someone else's an unoriginal end. I once stumbled across a piece of Red Dwarf fanfiction that served mainly to highlight the writer's favourite moments from this series. Whole scenes and exchanges between characters were copied verbatim from the show, with only a few lines of original writing serving mainly as slightly awkward bridges from one copied scene to another copied scene. I didn't, at the time, sit down and work out what percentage of the fic was a direct copy of lines of dialogue from the TV show, and it was long enough ago that I don't now recall the name of the fic or the writer to go out and look it up, but I would hazard a guess that maybe half of the contents of that fanfic were word-for-word repetition of the show's writing. So that would be quite extreme. I've read another fanfic where the main character of Quantum Leap leapt into the body of one of the characters from Lord of the Rings. With that story, there were some original scenes and a lot of thought processes that were invented around the scenario, and probably a significantly higher percentage of the fic was new writing than in the Red Dwarf example. But huge chunks of dialogue were copied word for word from the Lord of the Rings films, and the characters followed the Lord of the Rings plot. You can take this further and imagine a hypothetical piece of fanfiction that retells a canon scene, but adding the author's interpretation of what was going on inside the head of a character they've chosen for the point of view of the fic. This hypothetical fic would take the events of the TV show or film it's based on, and include elements of dialogue lifted line for line from the source, with maybe up to 90% of the content a direct copy. It would follow the plot and the action of the source material, and be utterly dependent on it. That hypothetical story is about as extreme as it gets as far as being tied to canon, before it becomes simply plagiarism. It's based completely on the original source, but with a few little bits of original description or interpretation added. Like the hypothetical perfectly original book, I have never seen a work of fanfic that derived from the original source, but that gives us the two extremes. And now we need to address the massive amount of grey area in between. Like fairy tale retellings. Are fairy tale retellings fanfiction? There are a number of books out there that reimagine classic tales. Ash, Cinder, Shadows on the Moon, and others are all young adult novels inspired by the Cinderella story. They are each very different from each other. In Ash, the protagonist makes a deal with a fairy, and is more interested in a romantic relationship with a huntress than with the prince. In Cinder, the protagonist is a cyborg and loses her artificial foot instead of a shoe when she's fleeing from the party. In Shadows on the Moon, the protagonist has magical illusion powers and goes to the ball as part of a revenge plot against the person who killed her family. All three books are very, very different from each other. They all have their own original elements, but they all draw somewhat on the elements from the same core story. So where do they fit on my scale of original to fanfic? Well, I would put them well over on the original side, but not at the extreme, because they do reuse familiar plot elements from an existing story. Some might question me putting them so far towards the original end. After all, what are these stories but Cinderella alternate universe fics? They all have a certain element of predictability. If I were to tell you that a story was a retelling of Cinderella, you might expect a few key plot elements to be in there. The main character will be forced to work and abused by a stepfamily. There's going to be a ball. She's probably going to lose some footwear, and so on. But is that any more predictable than, say, a detective story having some familiar elements to it? If you told me a particular book was a detective story, I would expect it to have a dead body discovered early on, a bunch of clues, some of which turn out to be red herrings, a character who appears like the obvious murderer, but who turns out not to be, and the book will resolve with the identifying of the true murderer. Would you call a murder mystery derivative and unoriginal because it contains some or all of those elements? No, they provide a framework around which the author builds the original story. And the same is true of fairy tale retellings. There will be a few elements which are familiar if you know the classic story. But if everything around those few elements is where the author gets to display their originality. On the flip side, some people may say that the fact that all 3 Cinderella stories I mentioned are published as novels would mean that they count as original fiction. But that is not as simple a dividing line as it would seem. To explain this, I'd like to bring in my next example, A Study in Emerald. This is a piece of Sherlock Holmes / H.P. Lovecraft fusion. A Holmes-in-style great detective is solving a murder in a world full of eldritch abominations inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft. The story draws on both of these sources heavily. There is a scene in which the detective identifies that the viewpoint character was in a war with nothing more than a quick glance, a scene that will feel very familiar to anyone who's read the first Sherlock Holmes book or who's watched BBC's Sherlock adaptation. This is a piece of fanfiction, and the author has openly acknowledged it as such. That author? Neil Gaiman. It is a work of fanfiction, but I first came across this story in an anthology of fantasy stories published through a traditional publisher. The reason it was possible is that the works it was inspired by are out of copyright. People can freely use the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and H.P. Lovecraft and have them published because the age of the works means that this is now legal, in a way that making money off stories based off, say, the Harry Potter books wouldn't be, although more on that later. Gaiman is a published author with a number of great books and short stories, and when he calls this piece a work of fanfiction, we should listen. And I would put this story on the non-original side of the scale, but probably not very far towards the end, because it draws heavily on the works it was inspired by. It has its own plot, and by combining the 2 sources, the author is able to create something new. Gaiman's story is far from the only example of authors taking out of copyright work and using the characters and their ideas in their own books. I mean, every film made featuring Dracula does just that. But I'm focusing on written works, so another good example of this type of work is the book Death Comes to Pemberley, which is a murder mystery sequel, sort of, to Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. This book uses the characters, the settings of Austen's novel, and makes references to the events in that original book. I would class it even more towards the fanfiction end of the scale than Gaiman's story, and yet it too is traditionally published. So traditional publication is not necessarily a good factor for whether or not a piece of work is original or derivative. And let's think about another story I would put at the other end of the scale. A while ago I read a story called Cornerstone. This is posted online as a piece of Teen Wolf fanfiction. It centres around 2 of the characters from that TV show. However, this particular story was an alternate universe work, meaning that the author made significant changes to the setting and backstory. The author removed all of the supernatural elements that are present in the original TV show. One of the 2 main characters was made into a war veteran suffering from PTSD, and the other was made blind and had a service dog. These changes to the backstories of the characters meant that there were significant differences between how the characters would have acted in the original show and how they acted in the fanfic. And I don't intend for this to be interpreted as criticism, because I think the author did a fantastic job of imagining how the differences in the lives of these two characters would have impacted their personalities. And the story had other major changes as well. A character who died before the start of the pilot episode and who got probably less than a minute of screen time in flashbacks in the TV show was alive and well in the fanfic and played a significant role in the story. But because her character barely appeared in the TV show, the author of the fanfic essentially created her characterization. That character's husband and child were wholly invented by the fanfic author, and a character who played a significant role in the TV show was dead before the start of the fanfic. All of these changes to the characters and a plot that has no connection whatsoever to the TV show's plot results in a story that feels thoroughly original. If you were to change the names of the characters and the town where most of the story is set, you could probably show the story to the writers and producers of the TV show, and they would not be able to guess that the story was based on their show. So even though Cornerstone is literally a piece of fan fiction, I would put it a lot closer to the original end of the spectrum than most of the other works I've discussed so far. Even more original than the fairy tale retellings, because those books rely on the original sources for key plot elements. There is a concept in fanfiction known as filing the serial numbers off. Essentially, this means taking a work that started out life as a piece of fanfiction, removing key indicators of that connection, usually by changing the names of the main characters, and then publishing that story as if it were original. Obviously, the more the author has deviated from the source material in the original fanfic, the easier it is to do this, and that means this usually happens with alternate universe stories, because the author has already gone in and changed the backstory. Probably the most famous example of this process is 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James. I am not going to go into detail about this book. If you want a review, there are other booktubers out there who have gone into details about all the ways that it is terrible. And if you haven't read it, please don't bother. It really is awful, but it serves as a brilliant example of the phenomena I'm discussing. The author wrote a piece of Twilight fanfiction, but removed all of the parts about vampires and imagined how the relationship would be between the protagonist and her love interest if, instead of being a supernatural creature, he was a billionaire into bondage. The story was different enough from the book series it was based on that she was able to change the names and publish it as a book, or more accurately, a series of books. The differences were significant enough that she was able to do this and make a great deal of money and get a movie deal without being sued for copyright infringement. Someone who is unfamiliar with the history of the book probably wouldn't be able to guess that it started out life as a piece of fan fiction based on a vampire romance series. And while it follows some of the plot elements of the first book, the later books diverge significantly, and because of all this, and despite its origins as a piece of fan fiction, I would still actually stick it over towards the original side. I would class it as at least as original as some of the fairy tale retellings I've read over the years, which should be evidence that original does not have to mean good. But there is this concept of transformation And I think it's interesting to note that the organisation behind the massive fanfiction archive AO3 is called the Organisation for Transformative Works. The principle of transformation is that a creator is taking elements from one thing and transforming it to create something new. This transformation may be relatively small, or it may be massive. There seems to be an acceptance that if the transformation is significant enough, a thing starts counting as original again. And that's where stories like 50 Shades of Grey slip through the loopholes of legality. One topic I haven't brought up so far, though, is parody. There are parodies out there of published works, like The Board of the Rings, or the Barry Trotter parody of Harry Potter. These works often take the original, poke fun at them, playing with some of the ideas, and generally using characters and plots that are clearly derived from the original work. These are things that should probably be classed as fanfiction, because they are clearly based on another work, and one that is in copyright, and they certainly sit well on the derivative side of the scale, probably further towards the unoriginal end than most of the examples I've discussed in this video, because they are frequently dependent on the original for their humour, and they may take plot threads, lines from the original and repurpose them as part of a joke. They are derived from the original just as fanfiction is, and yet parody is usually protected in the law. Someone can produce a parody work and profit from it without the threat of legal action, even if they do so without the permission of the original creator. In fact, Barry Trotter and the Shameless Parody was published in the US as Barry Trotter and the Unauthorized Parody, showcasing the fact that it was produced without the authorization of J.K. Rowling. And yet it was published by Gaiman, a reputable and significant publishing house. I said earlier we would come back to the subject of whether or not something like Harry Potter could be used traditionally published in a traditionally published way, and here it is. It seems strange to me and contradictory that a derived work is perfectly acceptable if it's comedic, but unacceptable if it's a serious piece. Fanfiction can be defined as fictional writing produced by fans of a work, using elements from that work for the enjoyment of fans in a non-profit manner. But the existence of out-of-copyright works makes the boundaries fuzzy, because the same sort of story that can only ever be written as fanfiction, when the work is in copyright, could be published as a full-fledged novel if the original work is out of copyright. And what can be legally published without copyright issues is a factor complicated by the existence of things like parodies, and the existence of repurposed fanfics. Original and fanfiction are not these two distinct categories. A work can be thoroughly original in terms of plot and concepts, but still be classed as fanfiction because it uses existing characters. Likewise, a story which is original in the sense of not being a fanfic might be a regurgitation of tired old tropes and cliches. In a world where reimaginings and retellings of classic tales are a staple of the young adult market, where writers have been drawing on Arthurian legend for centuries, where books like Wicked have become big enough to have been adapted into Broadway musicals, where Paradise Lost, a piece of literature based on biblical stories, is considered a literary classic, maybe we should accept that stories are stories and judge them individually for what they are, rather than dismissing a whole wealth of creativity as just fanfiction. To me, the big dividing line between fanfiction and original fiction is not any inherent merit or even originality, but simply the question of whether or not the author would be allowed to profit from their writing. And this is a very artificial barrier, and if the copyright law were to change tomorrow, changing what could be legally published and what couldn't wouldn't change the underlying originality, or lack of, in the works in questions. And there is a lot of originality that can be found under the broad umbrella of fanfiction. As much originality as can be found in any other category of fiction. So, thank you for watching all the way to the end. Let me know your thoughts. Do you agree with me? Do you think that fanfiction can be as original as original fiction? Leave me a note in the comment, and as always, like and subscribe if you want to see more.